Hello there. Welcome to Drifting Off Learning Channel. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day you have had, whatever thoughts are still circling slowly through your mind, like leaves turning on the surface of still water, you are welcome here. This is a place for you to rest. This is a place where nothing is required of you, where no task waits to be completed, where no question needs an answer, and no problem needs a solution. You have arrived somewhere quiet. You have arrived somewhere soft, and all that is asked of you in the gentlest possible way is simply that you allow yourself to be still. If you are lying down, let the surface beneath you hold all of your weight. You do not need to hold yourself up. Your bed, your pillow, the ground itself, all of it is here to carry you. And if you notice any places in your body that are still holding tension, any small knots in your shoulders or your jaw or your hands, simply notice them with a kind and curious attention, and then imagine that tension dissolving, slowly, the way a cube of sugar dissolves in warm water, gently, without force, until nothing is left but a sweet and quiet softness. Let your breathing slow just a little. There is no correct rhythm, no particular technique required. Simply let each breath come a little more easily, a little more fully, a little more naturally than the one before it. In and then out, like the tide moving gently along a dark shore somewhere very far away. In and then out, slow and steady and calm. Tonight, we are going to drift together toward one of the most still and quiet places on this planet. A place that almost no human being has ever seen with their own eyes. A place of ancient darkness and profound peace. We are going to let our minds settle downward, slowly and gently, through the cool blue water, through the dimming green of the deeper layers, through the fading gray twilight of the ocean's middle depths, and all the way down to the floor of the deep sea. The deep ocean is perhaps the most peaceful place on Earth. It is a world of extraordinary calm, of patient darkness, of slow and ancient rhythms that have been turning for millions of years without hurry, without noise, without any sense of urgency at all. Nothing down there rushes. Nothing demands your attention. And as we spend this quiet time together learning about that world, you are invited to let it carry you, the way the ocean itself carries everything, gently, completely, without effort. Before we begin our descent, there's a small and gentle thing to mention. If the atmosphere of this channel feels like something you would like to return to, a soft and welcoming voice, a curious and calming place to rest your mind, you are warmly invited to subscribe, to like this video, and to share it with anyone else who might be looking for a little more peace at the end of a long day. There is no pressure, no urgency, just a quiet invitation left open whenever you are ready. And now, we let that thought drift away like a bubble rising slowly upward through deep water, and we return to the stillness. The ocean covers a little more than 70% of the surface of this planet. If you could somehow see the Earth from above, stripped of its atmosphere, it would appear mostly blue, a great round water world with islands of pale brown and green scattered here and there like thoughts on the edge of sleep. And of all that vast blue expanse, the deepest, oldest, quietest portions are the ones we understand least. They are the farthest from sunlight and the farthest from us. They are where the ocean truly becomes itself, patient and enormous and still. To reach the deep ocean floor, you would first have to pass through all the layers of the ocean above it, and this journey itself is something to imagine slowly and peacefully as you settle into rest. Picture yourself floating, weightless, just below the surface of a calm sea. The water around you is warm and faintly lit, touched by the last traces of afternoon light from somewhere far above. You can see the shimmer of the surface if you look up, that silver and dancing ceiling of light. And then, slowly and gently, you begin to sink. Not falling, nothing so sudden as that. Simply descending, the way a feather settles through still air, drifting downward with complete ease. The first thing you would notice, if you were sinking slowly through the ocean's upper layers, is that the light begins to change. In the topmost zone of the ocean, the sunlight zone, the water is touched with brightness and warmth. This is where most of the creatures we think of when we think of the sea make their lives. The fish that flash silver in the sun, the dolphins that arc through the waves, the sea turtles that drift on the surface currents. But you are moving below all of that now. You are going somewhere deeper and quieter. As you sink past 200 meters below the surface, the light begins to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, the way evening comes in autumn. A slow and incremental dimming that you notice only when you realize that things look different than they did a few moments before. The blue deepens, the greens disappear first, and then the reds and oranges, absorbed by the weight of all that water above. What remains is blue, only blue, and then a blue so dark it is almost indistinguishable from the beginning of darkness. This middle layer of the ocean, the twilight zone, sits somewhere between 200 meters and 1,000 meters below the surface, and it is a world of profound strangeness and quiet beauty. Here, the light that filters down from above is so faint that it is more of a memory of light than light itself. The creatures that live in this twilight space have adapted to its perpetual dusk in extraordinary ways, carrying their own light within them or developing eyes of impossible sensitivity, eyes that can see by the faintest imaginable glow. But those stories belong to another layer, and you are still sinking, still descending, still drifting softly downward. Past the twilight zone, the ocean becomes what scientists call the midnight zone, the bathypelagic zone. And here, at last, there is no light at all from the sun above. None. The surface of the sea, with its wind and its waves and its warmth, is now so far above you that it might as well be another world entirely. And, in a very real sense, it is. Down here, the water is cold. Not the pleasant chill of a swimming pool or a mountain lake, but a deep and fundamental cold. The kind of cold that has existed unchanged for thousands upon thousands of years. The temperature in the deep ocean's midnight zone hovers somewhere around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, just barely above freezing, and it has been this way, steady and still, for longer than human civilization has existed. And still you are sinking, still descending, slowly and peacefully, through a darkness so complete and so thorough that the word darkness itself seems almost inadequate. This is not the darkness of a room with the lights off, where your eyes can still find the faint glow beneath a door or the dim outline of a window. This is absolute darkness, the darkness of the inside of the earth itself, a darkness with no gradations and no edges. It is a darkness that is also a kind of peace. At around 1,000 to 4,000 meters below the surface, you have entered the abyssal zone, and here the ocean floor begins to approach. This is where the great flat plains of the deep sea spread out beneath you, enormous and ancient, and almost perfectly still. The abyssal plain, as it is called, covers more of the Earth's surface than any other single type of landscape. More than all the deserts of the world combined. More than all the mountains. More than all the forests and prairies. The abyssal plain is the most abundant terrain on this planet, and almost no one ever sees it. Imagine it as you drift into sleep, a landscape of extraordinary flatness and extraordinary peace. The sediment on the abyssal plain is among the softest material on Earth, a fine and powdery accumulation of particles that have been falling, one by one, from the surface of the ocean for millions of years. Scientists call this material pelagic sediment, or more poetically, the ooze. It accumulates at a rate so slow that it is almost impossible to hold in the mind, roughly 1 to 2 centimeters every 1,000 years in some places. This means that if you were to press your hand gently into the surface of the deep sea floor, you might be touching sediment that began falling from the sunlit surface above during the last ice age, or earlier, during the time of the ancient Egyptians, or earlier still, when the first modern humans were walking across the grasslands of Africa. Each tiny particle in that sediment has its own quiet history. Some of those particles are the shells of microscopic creatures called foraminifera, organisms so small that thousands of them could fit on the surface of your thumbnail, and yet they are present in unimaginable quantities in the deep sea sediment. Their intricate and beautiful calcium carbonate shells settling slowly downward through all that dark water to eventually come to rest on the ocean floor, one layer at a time, building up the geological record of the ocean's history in a script so slow it makes human time feel like the blink of an eye. Other particles in that soft sediment are the silica skeletons of creatures called radiolaria, single-celled organisms that build elaborate and startlingly beautiful structures around themselves, structures that look like tiny sculptures, or the stained glass windows of a cathedral seen from very far away. These creatures live near the surface, in the sunlit water, and when they die, their delicate, glass-like skeletons sink, slowly and quietly, all the way to the bottom. That journey can take weeks. A single radiolarian shell, lighter than a breath, falling through kilometers of dark water for weeks on end, until it finally settles into the soft ooze of the ocean floor, where it will remain undisturbed for millions of years. There is something profoundly restful about that image, about the slowness and the certainty of it. Nothing is hurried. Nothing is wasted. Everything finds its way, eventually, to where it belongs, in its own time, at its own pace, without effort. The deep sea floor is not entirely flat and featureless, though it holds an enormous serenity even in its variation. Scattered across the abyssal plain are structures of extraordinary scale and quietude. There are underwater mountain ranges called mid-ocean ridges that wind around the entire planet like the seams of a tennis ball, longer than all the mountain ranges on land combined, and yet almost entirely unknown to the people who live on the surface above them. The mid-ocean ridge system stretches for roughly 65,000 kilometers, a continuous chain of underwater mountains circling the globe, and along its crest, the Earth's crust is continuously and very slowly splitting apart, new oceanic crust forming as magma wells up from below and solidifies in the cold, deep water. And in the places where the two sides of this rift are pulling apart, in the places where the Earth's interior is closest to the surface, there is warmth in the deep cold. Hydrothermal vents, as these features are called, are among the most remarkable places on this planet, and yet they exist in complete silence and complete darkness, seen only by the occasional deep-diving submersible and the extraordinary communities of creatures that cluster around them. The discovery of hydrothermal vents in the late 1970s was one of the most surprising moments in the history of science. Until then, it had been assumed, quite reasonably, that all life on Earth was ultimately dependent on sunlight. Plants use sunlight to grow. Animals eat plants or eat other animals that have eaten plants, and the whole beautiful web of life traces its energy back to that first photon absorbed by a leaf or a blade of grass or a phytoplankton cell on the surface of the sea. But in the deep ocean, in complete and absolute darkness, communities of life were found to be thriving, not on sunlight, but on the chemical energy released when superheated water from beneath the Earth's crust mixes with the cold seawater above. The water that emerges from hydrothermal vents can be extraordinarily hot, sometimes above 300 degrees Celsius, though it does not boil because of the immense pressure of all that ocean above. It is rich in minerals, in hydrogen sulfide and methane, and other chemical compounds that certain bacteria have learned, over millions of years, to use as fuel. These chemosynthetic bacteria, as they are called, form the base of an entire food web, and around the vents, in the otherwise barren darkness of the deep sea floor, life clusters in dense and almost paradoxically lush abundance. Picture the scene as you allow your eyes to close more completely, as you feel the pleasant weight of rest settling over you like a soft blanket. Around the hydrothermal vent, in a world of complete darkness and immense pressure and heat, there are forests of tube worms. These creatures grow in dense, waving clusters, their white tubes anchored to the rock and their feathery red plumes extended into the mineral-rich water, filtering out the bacteria they need to survive. The tube worms around some hydrothermal vents can grow to be more than 2 meters long, extraordinary in length for creatures of their kind, and they can live for what scientists believe may be more than 200 years, patiently extending their soft red plumes in the dark, warm water. Generation after generation, without sunlight, without seasons, without any of the ordinary markers of time that govern life near the surface. Alongside the tube worms, there are ghostly white crabs that pick their way across the mineral-encrusted rocks, their movements slow and deliberate in the cold, their pale bodies perfectly adapted to a world without light. There are mussels that cluster in dense beds around the vents, filtering the bacteria-rich water, their dark shells forming soft carpets on the rock. There are fish, peculiar and pale, that drift in and out of the warm water plume, their eyes sometimes vestigial or absent, their bodies attuned to chemical gradients in the water rather than to light. And there are shrimp, great swarms of specialized shrimp, creatures that have evolved over millions of years to live in this extreme environment, that cluster around the vent openings in numbers so large that they form what look, from a distance, like shifting clouds of pale smoke. These shrimp have no eyes in the conventional sense, but they have special photosensitive organs on their backs that may be able to detect the faint infrared glow of the superheated vent water, allowing them to navigate the edges of the thermal plume without being scalded. They exist in a world of heat and darkness and pressure, and they are perfectly at home. All of this life, all of this patient, quiet, extraordinary abundance in a place of utter darkness at the bottom of the sea. It is a reminder of something gently wonderful, that life is not fragile but resilient, not delicate but persistent, finding its way into every possible corner of this planet with a kind of patient creativity that has never needed to hurry. has never needed to force anything, has simply allowed itself to unfold, slowly and completely, over vast stretches of time. As you rest and breathe, let that thought be something soft to hold. Life finds a way, quietly and persistently, even in the dark. Beyond the hydrothermal vents, the abyssal plain continues in its ancient stillness. And, scattered across those flat, sediment-covered plains, there are objects that look, to the untrained eye, like ordinary stones. But they are not stones, or not exactly. They are manganese nodules, and they are among the most slowly formed solid objects on Earth. These lumpy, dark, potato-shaped concretions form on the surface of the deep sea sediment, growing around a tiny nucleus, perhaps a shark's tooth or a fragment of shell, and accumulating layers of manganese and iron and other minerals from the seawater around them. Their rate of growth is so extraordinarily slow that it is humbling even to consider, roughly 1 to 3 millimeters every million years. A nodule the size of a tennis ball may have taken more than 10 million years to form. 10 million years. The world, when those nodules began their patient growth, would have been unrecognizable to us. The continents were in different positions. The climate was different. The creatures that walked the land were entirely unlike anything alive today. And throughout all of that vast time, in the absolute cold and the absolute darkness of the deep sea floor, those small lumps of mineral were quietly accumulating, one infinitesimally thin layer at a time, growing with a patience so complete and so absolute that the concept of waiting does not even apply to them. They were not waiting. They were simply being in the only way they knew, slowly and steadily, and without any awareness of time at all. There is something almost like meditation in the image of the manganese nodule. A patience so thoroughgoing that it transcends patience entirely, becoming something else, something more like simple, uncomplicated presence. The nodule does not plan for its future or regret its past. It simply is in this moment, in this dark and quiet place, adding one more infinitesimal layer of itself to everything that has come before. You are allowed to be like that tonight, simply present, simply here, adding one more quiet breath to all the breaths that have come before, without plan, without urgency, without anything required of you at all. The darkness of the deep ocean is not the darkness of emptiness, however. Even in the most lightless depths of the sea, there is a kind of light, but it is light of a very different kind from sunlight. It is light made by living things, and it is called bioluminescence, and it is one of the most gently astonishing phenomena on this planet. Bioluminescence is the production of light through chemical reactions within a living organism, a process that has evolved independently dozens of times across the history of life on Earth, in bacteria and fungi, and fireflies on land, and in an extraordinary variety of ocean creatures from the surface all the way to the very deepest depths. In the ocean, bioluminescence is extraordinarily common. Scientists estimate that perhaps 76% of all ocean animals produce some form of biological light, though many of these creatures spend their lives in the deep sea, far from any human observer. The light produced by deep sea creatures comes in a variety of colors, though blue and blue-green are by far the most common, for a simple and beautiful reason. Blue light travels farthest through seawater before being absorbed. Evolution has tuned the light of the deep sea to the physics of the deep sea, and so the darkness of the abyss is punctuated, here and there, by points and trails and pulses of cold blue-green light, like stars in an underwater sky. Some of this light is used for communication. Certain species of squid and fish produce complex patterns of bioluminescent flashes that may carry information between individuals in their species. A language of light written in a darkness so profound that any other form of communication would be futile. These patterns can be extraordinarily intricate, sequences of pulses and colors and intensities that vary in ways scientists are only beginning to understand. A private conversation conducted in the dark, in the cold, in the silence. Some of the light is used for camouflage, which is perhaps the most counterintuitive use of it imaginable. Certain deep-sea creatures, including some fish and shrimp, produce bioluminescent light on their undersides in a pattern that precisely matches the faint downwelling light from the surface above them, making them effectively invisible when viewed from below. A predator looking up from deeper water, searching for the silhouette of a potential meal against the faint glow of the distant surface, would see nothing, because the prey is producing exactly the right amount and pattern of light to blend with the background. This strategy is called counterillumination, and it is a form of visual deception so elegant and so precisely calibrated that it speaks to the extraordinary power of evolution to find solutions to problems we might never have imagined. Some bioluminescent light serves as a lure. The anglerfish, perhaps the most famous resident of the deep sea, uses a luminescent lure dangling from a modified spine on its head to attract prey in the darkness. The light dangles and pulses in front of the fish's enormous mouth, and small creatures drawn toward it out of curiosity or instinct swim close enough to be caught. The anglerfish itself is a creature of a certain dark and peculiar beauty, with its enormous jaws and its needle-like teeth, and its lure glowing softly in the absolute dark. And it has a life history of almost dreamlike strangeness that we will come to presently, because its story has a quality of quiet wonder that belongs in this still and restful time. Female anglerfish are the ones with the lures, and they are significantly larger than the males of their species. The males, in some species, are tiny creatures barely an inch long, and their lives are consumed by a single purpose: to find a female in the vast darkness of the deep sea, and to mate. In certain species of anglerfish, the male finds a female and then bites into her side, and over time their tissues actually fuse together. The male's circulatory system connects to the female's. His immune system is suppressed so that her body does not reject him, and he gradually loses all of his organs except for the reproductive ones, becoming, in effect, a part of her body. She provides him with nutrients through their shared bloodstream, and he provides her with reproductive capability. And they live like this, merged together in the dark and the cold for the remainder of their lives. It is a story of extraordinary adaptation, of life finding its way in a world so dark and so vast and so empty that the ordinary problems of finding a mate have been solved in a way that defies any ordinary framework. And there is something oddly peaceful in the strangeness of it, in the reminder that life, in all its forms, arranges itself around the constraints of its world in ways that are creative and persistent and ultimately gentle, even when they look, from the outside, like something from a dream. Let that strangeness carry you a little further into the comfortable softness of rest. Let the oddness of the deep sea dissolve your ordinary categories a little. Loosen the usual frameworks of the waking mind, and allow your thoughts to become a little more fluid, a little more formless, a little more like the dark water itself. The pressure of the deep ocean is something that the human mind struggles to hold as a number, and perhaps it is better not to try. Instead, let it be felt as an image or a texture. At the surface of the sea, the weight of the atmosphere above presses down on everything at what we call one atmosphere of pressure, the baseline against which everything else is measured. But as you sink into the ocean, every 10 meters you descend adds another atmosphere of pressure, the weight of all that water accumulating steadily above you. By the time you have reached the floor of the deepest ocean trenches, you are experiencing more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, the equivalent of having 50 commercial jet airplanes stacked on top of every square inch of your body. And yet, there is life there too. In the deepest ocean trenches, in those narrow, elongated V-shaped valleys that plunge through the deep sea floor to even greater depths below, creatures have been found that live their entire lives under that almost incomprehensible pressure, perfectly comfortable, perfectly adapted, utterly at home in conditions that would crush any human-made vessel to powder in an instant. These trenches are the deepest places on Earth, and the deepest of them all is the Mariana Trench in the western Pacific Ocean, a long, narrow gash in the ocean floor that reaches its greatest depth at a point called Challenger Deep, which lies approximately 11 kilometers below the surface of the sea. 11 kilometers. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on land, rises only about 8.5 kilometers above sea level. If you were to place Mount Everest on the floor of the Mariana Trench, its peak would still be more than 2 kilometers below the ocean surface. The trench is deeper than the highest mountain, and it is dark, and it is cold, and it has been there for tens of millions of years, and it is, in its way, beautiful. Very few things have ever descended to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. In 1960, 2 humans made the journey in a specialized vessel called the Trieste, a bathyscaphe designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the deep. Jacques Picard and Don Walsh spent about 20 minutes on the bottom before ascending, and in those 20 minutes, they saw something that surprised them. A small flatfish resting on the sediment, alive and apparently quite untroubled by the conditions. The existence of that fish was later questioned by scientists who suggested it might have been a sea cucumber, misidentified in the excitement of the moment. But the deeper point stands. Life has been found even at the very bottom of the very deepest ocean, patient and persistent, and entirely unconcerned with the extraordinary nature of its circumstances. More recently, robotic vehicles, unmanned instruments lowered on long cables, or swimming autonomously through the dark, have explored the deepest trenches more thoroughly, and what they have found is a world of quiet abundance. Organisms called amphipods, small crustaceans related to the shrimp we see in shallow coastal waters, live in the Hadal Zone, the deepest zone of the ocean, in very large numbers. These creatures are highly specialized for life at extreme depth, their bodies containing high concentrations of pressure-stabilizing compounds that keep their cellular machinery functioning correctly under conditions that would destroy the cells of any surface organism. They scavenge organic material that sinks from above, feeding on the rain of particles that falls continually downward from the sunlit world far above, and they have been found in quantities large enough to suggest that the deep trenches are not barren deserts, but active and productive ecosystems. And there is something deeply comforting in that, in the knowledge that even in the deepest and darkest and most pressurized places on this planet, something is living and feeding and persisting. Life does not require comfort, does not require warmth or light or ease. It requires only an energy source and enough time, and given those, it will find its way, patient and inventive and endlessly resourceful, into every possible niche this world has to offer. But you are not required to find your way anywhere tonight. You are already exactly where you need to be, in the warmth and the softness of your resting place, with your breath slowing and your thoughts becoming gentler and more diffuse, like ink dropped into still water, spreading slowly outward, losing its sharp edges, becoming part of something larger and more peaceful. The midnight zone of the ocean, that lightless middle layer between 1,000 and 4,000 meters down, is home to a particular kind of snow, not the cold white snow of winter storms, not the snow that falls on mountain peaks and piles in soft drifts outside windows, but marine snow, a constant and gentle precipitation of organic particles that falls continuously through the dark water from the sunlit layers above, drifting downward through the lightless miles in an unending soft cascade. Marine snow is composed of the countless tiny fragments of life that have lived and died in the upper ocean. The shells of foraminifera, the remains of phytoplankton, the shed mucus of jellyfish, the fecal pellets of zooplankton, the fragments of fish scales, and the debris of countless creatures too small to name. All of this material, in various stages of decomposition, aggregates in the water column into particles large enough to be visible, pale and gossamer, and then it falls. Slowly, softly, endlessly through the dark water, like snow falling in a forest at night when everything is very still. If you were to sit at depth in a submersible and shine a light out through the viewport, you would see the marine snow drifting past in the beam, catching the light and glittering faintly before disappearing back into the dark. It has been described by the scientists and explorers who have seen it as one of the most beautiful things in the ocean. This constant, gentle precipitation of life's remnants through the cold and quiet dark. It never stops. Day and night, summer and winter, in every ocean on Earth, this slow and patient snowfall continues, the surface world shedding its material downward to feed the depths below, cycle upon cycle upon cycle, sustained by the patient turning of the planet through its seasons. The deep sea creatures that live in the midnight zone and below depend largely on this marine snow for their energy. The abyssal plain, for all its apparent barrenness, is continuously nourished by the falling material from above, and the organisms that live there, from the bacteria in the sediment to the sea cucumbers that move slowly across it, are all participating in the long and patient cycle of material moving from the surface world down into the deep. Sea cucumbers are among the most numerous large animals on the deep sea floor, and they are creatures of a very particular and gentle kind of strangeness. They are related to starfish and sea urchins, members of the echinoderm family, but they have elongated bodies rather than the radial symmetry of their relatives, and they move across the sediment of the deep sea floor in a slow and unhurried crawl, ingesting the soft ooze as they go and extracting the organic material it contains. They leave long trails in the sediment behind them, gentle winding lines that record their passage through the dark, and these trails can persist for years in the still water of the abyss before they are finally covered by new settling sediment. In some areas of the deep sea, sea cucumbers are extraordinarily abundant. Surveys with underwater cameras have found them clustered in densities of dozens per square meter, moving across the ocean floor in slow processions, each one minding its patient business, extracting its microscopic portion of nutrients from the ooze, contributing in its small way to the endless cycling of matter through the deep ocean ecosystem. They come in a variety of sizes and forms, some of them bright red or orange or purple when illuminated by artificial light. Though in their natural habitat they exist in permanent darkness and have no need for color. Certain species of deep sea cucumber have developed the ability to swim, which is a behavior that seems at odds with their generally unhurried character. When threatened, or perhaps when searching for new feeding grounds, these normally sedentary animals can release their grip on the sediment and begin moving their bodies in a slow undulation, rising into the water column and drifting with the slow currents, traveling distances that would be impossible for a creature constrained to crawling across the ocean floor. They are not graceful swimmers in the way that fish are graceful, but they are persistent and patient, and eventually they settle again to the bottom, somewhere new, and resume their quiet feeding. There is a whole suite of creatures adapted to life in that deep midnight water above the ocean floor, not quite settled into the sediment, but not quite free of it either, drifting in the cold, dark water column with a kind of patient weightlessness. Certain jellyfish live at these depths, their translucent bells pulsing slowly in the dark, their tentacles trailing beneath them like the fronds of an underwater fern. These deep-sea jellyfish are often bioluminescent, producing rings and pulses of cold blue light as they drift, and there is something genuinely dreamlike about the image of them. Ghostly and gently glowing, drifting in utter silence through the absolute dark of the deep ocean, pulsing quietly and continuously as they have done for hundreds of millions of years. Jellyfish, as a form of life, are among the oldest on this planet. Fossil evidence suggests that creatures essentially similar to modern jellyfish have been drifting through the world's oceans for more than 500 million years. They predate the dinosaurs by hundreds of millions of years. They were here long before the first fish swam, long before the first land plant reached its leaves toward the sun, long before anything with a backbone existed anywhere on Earth. They have watched, in their patient and unconscious way, the entire pageant of complex life on this planet unfold and change and diversify around them. And through all of that vast time, they have continued to pulse and drift and feed, exactly as they always have, in the cold and the dark and the deep. 500 million years is a span of time so large that it loses meaning when encountered as a number. But let it rest in you as a feeling, as a texture of quiet enormity. Imagine all the creatures that have lived on this planet and died, and been replaced by others. Imagine all the mountains that have risen and eroded away. Imagine all the seas that have swelled and retreated. Imagine the continents themselves, moving in their slow tectonic drift, rearranging themselves across the face of the planet over hundreds of millions of years. Through all of that change, the jellyfish has remained, drifting, pulsing, feeding, patient and unconcerned, in its deep and quiet way, with anything but the immediate softness of the water around it. The deep ocean is not entirely static and silent, though its stillness is profound. There are slow and enormous currents that move through the deep water, carrying cold, dense water from the polar regions toward the equator and back, in a pattern of circulation so large and so slow that a single parcel of water might take more than 1,000 years to complete one full circuit of the global ocean. This circulation, called thermohaline circulation, or sometimes the ocean conveyor belt, is driven by differences in temperature and salinity in the water, and it plays an essential role in regulating the climate of the entire planet, carrying heat, and cold and nutrients around the globe in a slow and patient cycle that has been turning in various forms for as long as oceans have existed on this world. The deepest, densest, coldest water in this circulation forms primarily in two places: the North Atlantic, near Greenland and Iceland, and the Antarctic, around the continent at the South Pole. In these regions, the surface water becomes so cold and so dense with salt, as sea ice forms and excludes the salt from the ice crystals, that it sinks, not dramatically, not in a sudden plunge, but in a slow and stately descent. The heavy cold water slipping beneath the warmer, lighter water above, and beginning its long journey along the ocean floor. This sinking water, which scientists call North Atlantic deep water or Antarctic bottom water depending on where it formed, is among the oldest water in the ocean. Some parcels of water circulating in the deep abyss have not been in contact with the atmosphere for more than 1,000 years, have not seen sunlight or felt wind, or been touched by rain since before the Renaissance, since before the Age of Exploration, since before all of the history that feels most immediate and significant to us now. They have been circling silently and slowly in the dark, far below the world we inhabit, utterly removed from its noise and urgency, patient as the mountains, old as winter. You can rest in the knowledge of that patience. Somewhere, right now, there is water moving through the deepest trench of the Pacific Ocean that last touched the air while medieval scholars were transcribing ancient texts. There is water sinking past the abyssal plains of the Atlantic that last felt sunlight while the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe were being built. There is water in the Southern Ocean that has been circling the frozen continent for so long that the civilization that produced the person listening to these words did not exist when that water was last at the surface. And all of it is quiet. All of it is cold. All of it is patient and unhurried and deeply, completely at peace. The salinity of deep ocean water is remarkably consistent. While surface waters can vary considerably in saltiness depending on rainfall and evaporation and the input of rivers, the deep ocean settles toward an equilibrium, a steady and even distribution of dissolved minerals that changes very little over very long periods of time. The ocean has been salty for as long as it has existed, its salinity building over billions of years as the rivers of the continents carried dissolved minerals to the sea. And the particular mix of salts in seawater, the ratio of sodium to magnesium to calcium to potassium, and all the other elements present in smaller quantities, has been maintained in a remarkable, steady state for hundreds of millions of years. The input of new minerals from rivers and hydrothermal vents balanced by the removal of minerals through sediment formation and other chemical processes. This chemical stability is itself a kind of deep peace, a constancy that has persisted through ice ages and warm periods, through mass extinctions and evolutionary explosions, through the rise and fall of mountain ranges, and the opening and closing of ocean basins. The ocean is the great stabilizer of this planet's chemistry, absorbing and buffering and balancing in ways that have allowed life to persist and diversify for billions of years. It is vast enough and old enough to absorb enormous amounts of change without losing its fundamental character, its saltiness, its coldness in the deep, its patient cycling of material from surface to floor and back again. There is deep comfort in the stability of the ocean. In a world that changes rapidly and sometimes alarmingly, the deep ocean has been doing the same things it has always done, at the same slow and patient pace through countless upheavals and transformations. Its constancy is not indifference, but a kind of fundamental dependability. The dependability of something so large and so ancient that ordinary time cannot touch it. Let that constancy be something you borrow for tonight. Let the ocean's deep stability become, for just this hour, a quality of your own rest. Let your body become as heavy and as settled as the sediment on the abyssal plain, layer upon layer of quiet accumulated over all the years of your life, pressed gently down into a comfortable and stable peace. Let your breath become as slow and regular as the deep ocean currents, moving in their long, patient circuits, never hurrying, never stopping, always present. Among the most evocative of the deep sea's many wonders is a phenomenon that was first described properly by scientists only in the mid-20th century, though the creatures responsible for it had been performing it every night since long before any human being existed to observe it. This is the phenomenon called diel vertical migration, and it is the largest coordinated movement of living organisms on this planet. Every evening, as darkness falls on the surface of the ocean, enormous quantities of small creatures, primarily zooplankton and small fish, rise from the depths where they have been hiding during the daylight hours toward the surface, where they feed on the phytoplankton and other organisms concentrated in the sunlit layer. And every morning, before the sun has climbed high enough to illuminate the waters where predators hunt by sight, these creatures sink back down again, retreating to the safety of the dark middle layers to wait out another day. The scale of this migration is almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 10 and 15% of the carbon captured at the surface by photosynthesis every day is carried down into the deep ocean by the bodies and waste products of the organisms participating in diel vertical migration. This daily movement is one of the primary mechanisms by which the deep ocean is connected to the surface, by which the energy and material of the sunlit world is transported downward into the dark, feeding the deep sea ecosystem in a rhythm as regular as the turning of the earth. Imagine it, this enormous nightly pulse of life rising and falling through the water column. Billions upon billions of tiny creatures moving upward through the dark as the sun sets, spreading out through the surface water to feed in the night, and then retreating again before dawn, sinking back into the protection of the deep, day after day, season after season, year after year, since long before the first human being looked up at the night sky and wondered about the lights above. The deep ocean breathes in its way with this daily rhythm, inflating with life every night and exhaling it back into the depths every morning. The creatures that participate in this migration are often equipped with specialized organs for managing their buoyancy as they move up and down through the water column. Many deep sea fish have swim bladders, gas-filled chambers that they can inflate or deflate to adjust their density and maintain neutral buoyancy at different depths. Certain species of deep sea fish can change their buoyancy remarkably quickly, moving through hundreds of meters of water in a matter of hours by carefully managing the gas in their swim bladders. Other organisms, including many species of copepods and other crustaceans, use oil-filled bodies to achieve buoyancy, storing lipids that are less dense than water and allow them to float at the appropriate depth without expending energy. The oil-filled bodies of these creatures are themselves a link in the deep ocean's food web. When the small crustaceans die or are eaten, their lipid stores become available to larger predators, and these fats, rich in energy, are among the most valuable nutrients in the deep sea economy. The deep ocean is not a rich environment in terms of energy, but it is not barren either. and life has evolved to extract and use every available calorie with extraordinary efficiency. Among the most specialized of all deep-sea organisms are the so-called extremophiles, creatures that have adapted to live in conditions that would kill most other forms of life. At hydrothermal vents, as we have already drifted past, temperatures can exceed 300 degrees Celsius in the immediate vicinity of the vent opening, and the pressure is more than 200 times that of the surface atmosphere. And yet, there are bacteria that thrive in these conditions, organisms called hyperthermophiles that actually require extremely high temperatures to function properly, whose enzymes work best at temperatures that would denature and destroy the proteins of any ordinary organism. These extraordinary bacteria belong to a domain of life called archaea, which is one of the three great branches of the tree of life, alongside bacteria and the eukarya, that includes all plants, animals, fungi, and other organisms with nucleated cells. Archaea were once thought to be a specialized subset of bacteria, but genetic analysis has shown that they are a profoundly different form of life, with their own distinct biochemistry and evolutionary history. Many archaea live in extreme environments, from the superheated water around hydrothermal vents to the highly acidic environments of volcanic springs, to the intensely salty waters of salt lakes. And studying them has expanded our understanding of the possibilities of life in ways that continue to illuminate the search for life on other worlds. Because if life can exist at hydrothermal vents on the floor of the deepest ocean, in complete darkness, under crushing pressure, at temperatures that boil water, sustained by chemical energy rather than sunlight, then perhaps life can exist in other similarly extreme environments elsewhere in the solar system. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn, in particular, harbor oceans of liquid water beneath their icy crusts, oceans kept liquid by the tidal heating of their parent planets rather than by sunlight, oceans that might have hydrothermal vent systems of their own. The discovery of the deep sea vent communities on Earth has made the idea of life on these distant ocean moons feel not fantastical, but almost reasonable, a natural extension of what we now know about life's resourcefulness and patience. But these thoughts of other worlds are distant and speculative, and you do not need them to carry you anywhere tonight. Let them drift away, like the marine snow drifting past a viewport in the dark. You are already in the only world you need, warm and still, your breathing slow and even, your thoughts becoming softer at their edges, more willing to blur and dissolve into the comfortable darkness of approaching sleep. The giant squid is an animal that has fired the human imagination for centuries, appearing in myths of sea monsters and krakens, spoken of by sailors with a mixture of awe and dread. For most of recorded history, the giant squid was known only from fragmentary evidence, from tentacles and body parts found in the stomachs of sperm whales, from bodies washed up on beaches, from occasional sightings by fishermen of enormous tentacles breaking the surface in the dark. The living animal, alive and active in its natural environment, was not photographed until 2004, when a Japanese research team managed to capture images of a giant squid attacking a baited hook at a depth of around 900 meters in the Pacific. The images they captured were remarkable, and they told a story of an animal very different from the terrifying creature of sailors' nightmares. The giant squid, in its natural habitat, is an agile and dynamic predator, but it is also a creature of the dark and quiet deep, living its life in the mesopelagic and bathypelagic zones of the ocean, where human beings have never ventured without mechanical assistance. Its eyes are the largest of any living animal, up to 30 centimeters in diameter. Dinner plate-sized organs that are specialized to detect the bioluminescent flashes of other creatures in the dark, and perhaps the faint shadows cast by sperm whales moving above in the twilight zone. The sperm whale is the giant squid's primary predator, and the relationship between these two enormous animals, conducted in the darkness of the deep ocean, is one of the great unexplored dramas of the natural world. Sperm whales dive to extraordinary depths in search of squid, holding their breath for up to 90 minutes and descending to more than 2,000 meters below the surface, navigating by echolocation in the complete darkness, sending out clicks of sound that bounce back from the bodies of potential prey. The scars on many sperm whales, long circular marks left by the suckers on squid tentacles, suggest that these encounters are not always easy for the whale, that sometimes the squid fights back, grasping the whale with its powerful tentacles as the whale attempts to swallow it. But all of this drama takes place in silence, in absolute darkness, at depths that no human being will ever visit without extraordinary technology. It is a world entirely removed from our daily experience, unfolding in the cold and the dark as it has for millions of years, without audience, without documentation, without any awareness of the small warm creatures on the surface of the sea above who wonder about it. The colossal squid, which is distinct from and in some ways even more extraordinary than the giant squid, is found primarily in the deep waters of the Southern Ocean surrounding Antarctica. It is the largest invertebrate on Earth by mass, though not necessarily by length, and it possesses the largest eyes of any known animal, eyes even larger than those of the giant squid, and equipped with special photophores that may help it detect bioluminescence in the dark. The colossal squid is a creature of the deep Antarctic waters, living at depths that approach 2 kilometers, and almost nothing is known about its behavior, its communication, its reproduction, or its social structure, if it has any. It is one of the largest and most mysterious creatures on Earth, and we know almost nothing about how it lives. The deep ocean is full of such mysteries, creatures and phenomena that are known only in the most fragmentary way, glimpsed briefly by robotic cameras or trawled from the depths by nets and studied dead or dying on the decks of research ships. Every year, new species are described from the deep sea, creatures no human being has ever seen before, brought up from the dark and cataloged and named and added to the growing list of life on this planet. Some of these new species are small and perhaps unsurprising to non-specialists. New species of deep sea worm or crustacean or bacteria. But occasionally they are large and startling. New species of shark or fish or invertebrate that speak to how little we know about the deep ocean even now, even in an age when satellites can photograph every square meter of the Earth's surface from space. There are places in the deep ocean where entire ecosystems have been found clustered around features called cold seeps, which are the quieter cousins of hydrothermal vents. At cold seeps, fluids rich in methane and hydrogen sulfide seep slowly up through the ocean floor, not superheated, but at ambient deep sea temperatures, and the same chemosynthetic bacteria that power hydrothermal vent communities can thrive here, supported by the chemical energy in the seeping fluid. Cold seep communities are often extraordinarily long-lived, because the flow of chemicals from below is slow and steady and can persist for thousands of years, allowing the slow-growing organisms that depend on it to build up dense and stable communities over enormous timescales. Among the most remarkable organisms found at cold seeps are the ice worms, small creatures that live embedded in solid methane hydrate, the ice-like substance that forms when methane gas is trapped in a crystalline structure of water molecules at the low temperatures and high pressures of the deep sea floor. Ice worms were discovered only relatively recently, in the late 1990s, and they remain one of the most mysterious organisms in the deep ocean. They move through the methane hydrate, as if through soft mud, eating the bacteria that colonize the hydrate surface, and they appear to be perfectly adapted to life in one of the strangest substances on Earth. Almost nothing is known about their biology, their reproduction, or how they manage to survive in methane-rich conditions that would kill most organisms. The deep ocean floor is also scattered with the bones of whales, and these whale falls, as scientists call them, are ecosystems in themselves. When a large whale dies and its body sinks to the ocean floor, it creates an enormous input of organic material in an environment where organic material is usually very scarce, and the deep sea community responds to this windfall in a succession of stages that can play out over decades. The first stage is the mobile scavenger stage, in which large mobile animals, including sleeper sharks, hagfish, and various crustaceans, arrive at the carcass and consume the soft tissue, stripping the body down to bone relatively quickly in ecological terms, often within a few months. Hagfish are particularly notable participants in this process, creatures of ancient lineage that have existed essentially unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. They are soft-bodied, jawless, eel-like animals that feed by burrowing directly into the bodies of dead animals and consuming them from the inside, a process that sounds unpleasant but serves an essential ecological function in the deep sea. After the mobile scavengers have consumed the soft tissue, the enrichment opportunist stage begins, in which smaller organisms, including bristleworms, crustaceans, and various mollusks, colonize the bones and the surrounding sediment, exploiting the nutrient-rich environment created by all that organic matter. This stage can last for years, as the enriched sediment around the whale fall continues to support an unusually dense community of organisms. And then, over longer timescales, comes what scientists call the sulfophilic stage, in which the whale bones themselves become a habitat for chemosynthetic organisms similar to those found at hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. As bacteria decompose the lipid-rich bone, they release sulfide compounds, and the same chemosynthetic food web that supports vent communities can establish itself at the whale fall. This stage can persist for decades, or, in the case of very large whale falls, perhaps even centuries, as the bones slowly yield their chemical energy to the community around them. A single whale fall, then, can support a sequence of distinct ecosystems spanning more than a century, each stage replacing the previous one as the resources available change and diminish. It is a long and patient story of community and succession, of the recycling of life's materials through many different forms before they are finally dispersed back into the sediment of the deep sea floor. Every whale that has ever died and sunk to the ocean floor has become, in its way, a city, a series of cities, a whole urban history played out in the dark and the cold over generations of creatures that most people will never know exist. There is a comfort in the idea of the whale fall, in the completeness of it, in the way that even death in the deep ocean is not an ending but a transformation, not a loss but a redistribution of energy and matter that sustains many other lives. Nothing is wasted in the deep ocean. Everything is eventually used, transformed, passed from one form to another in the patient cycle of life and death, and decomposition and renewal. The ocean is a closed system at the longest timescales, and within it, matter moves in circles, rising to the surface and sinking again, being captured by organisms and released by them, accumulating in sediment and being released by subduction and volcanism and returned to the surface, on and on and on, for as long as the planet persists. As you breathe slowly and let your body become heavier and more settled, let that sense of cycle be something peaceful to hold. You are part of a cycle too, not a small one, but an enormous one. The same atoms that make up your body having passed through countless other forms before finding their current arrangement. And, after their time in this particular configuration, they will move on to other forms, other arrangements, other expressions of the same patient and persistent matter that makes up everything. There is no urgency in this cycle. There is no rush. Everything arrives when it arrives, and moves on when it moves on, and the ocean accepts all of it with the same quiet equanimity. The deep sea floor is a landscape that changes very slowly, and yet it does change. The slow movement of the tectonic plates that make up the Earth's crust carries the ocean floor across the planet at a pace of a few centimeters per year, about the rate at which human fingernails grow. This movement, so slow that it is impossible to perceive directly, carries entire sections of the ocean floor and everything living on them gradually toward the mid-ocean ridges, where new crust is forming, or toward the subduction zones, where old oceanic crust dives beneath the edges of continents or beneath other sections of oceanic crust, returning eventually to the mantle below. The oldest oceanic crust on Earth is found in the western Pacific, where sections of seafloor that formed more than 200 million years ago have survived without being subducted. 200 million years ago, the dinosaurs were just beginning their long dominance of the land. The continents were in entirely different positions, many of them clustered into the supercontinent Pangaea. The Atlantic Ocean was just beginning to open, a narrow proto-Atlantic perhaps the size of the modern Mediterranean. And yet, sections of the ocean floor that were forming at that time are still there, still moving slowly across the basin of the Pacific, still accumulating sediment, still hosting the slow and patient processes that define the deep sea. The sediment on those ancient sections of seafloor is correspondingly thick and ancient, a record of more than 200 million years of marine life falling from above, layer by layer, year by year, season by season, building up a geological archive of extraordinary depth and detail. Scientists who drill through this sediment and extract cores of the ancient material can read the history of the ocean and the climate in those layers, seeing how the composition of the deep sea community changed over millions of years, how the chemistry of the ocean evolved, how the climate of the planet swung between warm periods and cold periods and back again. This reading of the deep sea sediment is one of the most powerful tools in the study of Earth's past. By analyzing the isotopic composition of the shells of foraminifera preserved in the sediment, scientists can reconstruct the temperature of the surface ocean and the volume of polar ice at the time those organisms lived, providing a detailed record of climate change over millions of years. This record has been essential in understanding how the Earth's climate system works, how sensitive it is to various influences, and how it has changed in the past in ways that can inform our understanding of how it may change in the future. But for now, the details of that record are not what matters. What matters in this quiet hour is simply the depth of that archive, the idea of millions of years of history preserved in the soft darkness of the ocean floor, patient and precise, waiting to be read by curious and careful scientists with the right tools and the right questions. The ocean keeps its records faithfully and without judgment, accumulating the evidence of everything that has lived in its waters without selection and without preference, a perfect and impartial librarian of the history of life on Earth. The trenches of the deep ocean are scattered across all the world's ocean basins, though they are concentrated in the Pacific, which is ringed by subduction zones. Each trench has its own particular character, its own depth and width and community of organisms. The Japan Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Philippine Trench, the Kermadec Trench, each of these narrow valleys descending below the abyssal plain into a darkness deeper than the darkness of the abyss. Each with its own community of hadal organisms adapted to its particular pressures and its particular chemical environment. The hadal zone, as this deepest realm of the ocean is called, named for Hades, the underworld of Greek mythology, is one of the least explored environments on Earth. The technological challenges of reaching these depths are formidable, and it was only in the past few decades, with advances in materials science and submersible design, that scientists have been able to study the hadal zone in any systematic way. What they have found has been surprising, both in the abundance of life at extreme depths and in the particular adaptations that make that life possible. One of the most important adaptations for life at hadal depths is the presence of a molecule called piezolite, or trimethylamine oxide, which is found in the tissues of many deep-sea organisms and appears to stabilize proteins against the denaturing effects of high pressure. Without such stabilizing molecules, the proteins that carry out the chemistry of life would fold incorrectly under the pressure of the deep trenches, ceasing to function and causing the death of the organism. With these pressure-stabilizing molecules, the proteins maintain their correct three-dimensional shapes even under crushing pressure, allowing the chemistry of life to proceed normally. The concentration of trimethylamine oxide in deep-sea organisms increases with depth, a gradient that has been measured across a wide range of species and appears to be a fundamental requirement for life below a certain depth. This requirement may actually set a theoretical maximum depth at which animal life is possible, because above a certain concentration, trimethylamine oxide itself begins to interfere with the osmotic balance of cells. This theoretical depth limit for animal life has been calculated to be somewhere around 8,500 meters. Interestingly, close to the depths at which animal life has actually been found to be absent in surveys of the very deepest trenches. This is the kind of elegant constraint that the physical world imposes on life. A limit set not by accident, but by the fundamental chemistry of proteins and osmosis and pressure. A boundary that life has approached as closely as it possibly can and can go no further. And in approaching that boundary, life has done everything in its power to adapt, to find the molecules and the mechanisms and the strategies that allow existence as close to the limit as possible, pushed there by the patient pressure of millions of years of evolution. The abyssal hills are another feature of the deep sea floor that most people never think about, though they are one of the most common landforms on the surface of this planet. These low, rounded mounds rise gently from the abyssal plain, reaching heights of between 50 and a few hundred meters, and they cover more than 30% of the Earth's surface, making them more extensive than any other single topographic feature. They are formed by the uneven cooling and fracturing of oceanic crust as it spreads away from the mid-ocean ridges, and they are draped in sediment that softens their contours, giving them a rounded and gentle appearance. The abyssal hills are essentially invisible to anyone on the surface. They lie beneath kilometers of water, without any expression at the surface that might reveal their presence. They are tracked by instruments that measure the depth of the ocean floor using sound, sending pulses of acoustic energy downward and measuring the time it takes for the echo to return. And from these measurements, detailed maps of the deep sea floor have been assembled over decades of scientific research. But the resolution of these maps is often limited, because the deep ocean is so vast and the research vessels that collect the data are few and slow, and many areas of the deep sea floor have been mapped only at coarse resolution, with features smaller than a few kilometers unresolved. This means that there are mountains on the floor of the ocean that have never been seen by any instrument, that lie unknown beneath the dark water, rising 100 meters from the surrounding plain, inhabited by whatever communities of organisms have colonized their flanks, completely unmapped and unnamed. There are valleys and ridges and fields of hydrothermal vents and cold seeps that have never been visited by any submersible, that exist in a darkness and an isolation so complete that they might as well be on another planet. The deep ocean is, in this sense, the last great unexplored realm on Earth, more foreign and more mysterious than the surface of the Moon, which has been photographed in exhaustive detail by dozens of spacecraft. More than 80% of the ocean floor remains unmapped at high resolution. More than 80%. In an age when we can photograph the surface of Mars in detail fine enough to see individual boulders, the floor of our own ocean is largely unknown. A vast and dark and quiet world that continues to hold its secrets with a patience that has not diminished and shows no signs of diminishing. Let that mystery be something restful rather than unsettling. The world is larger and more intricate and more various than any mind can contain, and that is not a problem but a gift, a guarantee that wonder will never be exhausted, that there will always be more to know, more to discover, more to marvel at. The deep ocean will still be there tomorrow, patient and dark and full of its quiet secrets, waiting in no hurry for whoever comes next to look at it with curious and careful eyes. And you, tonight, are not required to know any of it. You are only invited to let it carry you, the way the ocean carries everything, gently and completely without effort. The sound of the deep ocean, for those few scientists who have had instruments sensitive enough to record it, is not silence. Complete silence does not exist anywhere in the ocean, because the ocean is a medium through which sound travels exceptionally well, much better than through air, and sounds from near and far are always present, arriving from distances that can be thousands of kilometers. What the deep ocean sounds like is a very low and very quiet rumble, a background of sound so low in frequency that the human ear can barely perceive it, made up of distant earthquakes and the movement of currents and the low songs of whales traveling across entire ocean basins. The blue whale, the largest animal that has ever existed on Earth, is a producer of some of the loudest and lowest frequency sounds made by any living creature. The calls of blue whales travel thousands of kilometers through the ocean, their low moaning songs heard by other whales on the far side of ocean basins. And these songs have been recorded by hydrophones placed in the deep sound channel, the SOFAR channel as it is called, a layer of water at a depth of roughly a kilometer, where sound can travel extraordinary distances because of the particular way that temperature and pressure interact to create a minimum in the speed of sound. The SOFAR channel was discovered during the Second World War by scientists studying underwater acoustics, and it has since become one of the most intensively studied features of the deep ocean. Animals that produce sounds at frequencies that propagate efficiently through this channel can communicate with others of their species across distances of thousands of kilometers, a fact that was not suspected until relatively recently, and that implies a richness of long-distance communication in the ocean that is still being explored and understood. Imagine the sound of a blue whale's song, that low and mournful rumble, propagating through the dark water of the deep ocean, traveling 1,000 kilometers, 2,000, arriving at last at the place where another whale is moving slowly through the cold water, and perhaps responding, sending its own low song back in the direction from which the first arrived. This conversation, conducted across an ocean in darkness, in a frequency so low it is felt as much as heard, has been happening for millions of years, long before any human being existed to wonder about it. It is one of the most private and most vast communications in the history of life on this planet. The blue whale was once thought, not many decades ago, to be on the verge of extinction. Commercial whaling in the 19th and early 20th centuries reduced blue whale populations to a fraction of their former size, and by the mid-20th century, there were perhaps only a few hundred animals left in some populations, down from numbers in the tens or hundreds of thousands. The cessation of commercial whaling has allowed blue whale populations to slowly recover in some areas, though they remain far below their historical numbers and face continuing threats from ship strikes and entanglement in fishing gear, and changes in the distribution of their krill prey. But the blue whales that remain are still singing, still moving through the dark ocean in their slow and ancient way, still following the currents and the seasons and the distribution of their food across the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Southern Ocean, still communicating with one another across distances that make the scale of the ocean feel immediate and real. They are among the longest-lived animals on Earth, with individuals surviving for more than a century in some cases, and the oldest blue whales alive today were born in an ocean very different from the current one, before the era of industrial shipping and ocean warming, and the many other changes that the past century has brought. There is something moving about the continued existence of the blue whale, the persistence of the largest animal that has ever lived through the enormous pressures and changes of the modern world, its continued presence in the dark water, its continued song in the low frequencies that travel through the SOFAR channel. It is a reminder that the ocean is still alive, still wild, still performing its ancient functions, still home to creatures of extraordinary scale and mystery and beauty. And the deep ocean supports that life, as it always has, cycling nutrients and maintaining the chemical conditions that allow the surface ocean to be productive, absorbing heat and carbon from the atmosphere and distributing it through its slow global circulation, providing the stable and ancient foundation on which the rest of the ocean's ecology rests. The deep seafloor is colonized by a community of organisms that moves and changes over time in response to the availability of food, the nature of the substrate, the presence of hard structure like rock or wood or whalebone, and the particular characteristics of the water flowing across it. But the pace of change in this community is slow, much slower than the pace of change in shallow coastal ecosystems, because the environmental variability of the deep sea is much less than that of the shallow sea. There are no tides, no storms, no seasonal temperature swings, no cycles of flooding and drought. There is only the slow and steady passage of cold, dark, high-pressure time. In this stable environment, the organisms of the deep sea have evolved life history strategies that reflect the stability around them. Deep sea fish are often extraordinarily long-lived, with some species surviving for more than a century. The orange rowfee, a deep sea fish that was heavily commercially exploited before scientists understood its biology, can live for more than 150 years, meaning that fish caught in the 1990s had been swimming in the deep ocean since before the Second World War. The grenadier, another commercially important deep-sea species, is believed to live for at least 80 to 100 years. The Greenland shark, which lives in cold, deep water rather than on the ocean floor but is adapted to similar slow conditions, has been aged at more than 400 years, making it the oldest known vertebrate animal on Earth. 400 years. A Greenland shark alive today might have been born in the early 1600s, might have been swimming through the cold, dark water of the North Atlantic while Shakespeare was writing his plays, and Galileo was looking through his telescope at the moons of Jupiter. It has been moving slowly through the dark water for all of those centuries, feeding on fish and seals and whatever other food it can find, growing very slowly, aging in the pace of its cold world. It may not reach sexual maturity until it is more than 150 years old. It lives in a time frame so different from our own that it makes the ordinary human lifespan feel brief and bright and urgent, like a spark above the long, slow fire. Let the long, slow time of the deep ocean enfold you now as your own sense of urgency fades and your breathing deepens, and the thoughts that were so insistent an hour ago become gentler and more distant. The deep ocean does not hurry. The deep ocean has never hurried. And for this night, in the warmth and the stillness of your resting place, you are invited to borrow just a little of that ancient patience, to let time slow around you, to let the day dissolve into the quiet dark, the way a particle of marine snow dissolves before it reaches the ocean floor. There are so many more creatures of the deep ocean that have not yet been encountered in this quiet journey, organisms of such strangeness and such patience that they feel like the inventions of a very particular kind of dream. The vampire squid, for instance, is a creature that occupies its own taxonomic order. Neither quite a squid nor quite an octopus, a relic of an ancient lineage that has survived essentially unchanged for millions of years. Its name comes from its dark coloration and the cloak-like webbing that connects its arms, which it can spread around itself like a cape when threatened. But despite its dramatic name, the vampire squid is not a predator. It is a detritivore, feeding on marine snow, on the gentle rain of organic particles that drifts down through its deep, oxygen-poor habitat. The vampire squid has adapted to live in the oxygen minimum zone of the ocean, a layer of water between about 200 and 1,000 meters depth, where oxygen levels are so low that most other animals cannot survive for long. This is a remarkable adaptation because it allows the vampire squid to occupy a refuge inaccessible to most predators, safe in water that would suffocate anything without its specialized physiology. Its blood contains a highly efficient oxygen-carrying pigment called hemocyanin, which is copper-based and gives the blood a blue color, and this pigment allows it to extract enough oxygen from the extremely oxygen-poor water around it to sustain its slow and patient life. When threatened, the vampire squid can eject a cloud of bioluminescent mucus rather than the ink that other cephalopods use for defense. A cloud of glowing material that hangs in the water and may confuse or distract a predator, while the squid slips away into the dark. And when it wants to appear threatening, it can invert its webbed arms over its head, displaying the sharp-looking spines along the inner surface of its arms in what looks like a defensive posture. Its whole biology is a study in elegant adaptation to a very particular and very challenging environment. And it goes about its ancient life in the oxygen-poor dark with the same calm indifference to human observation that characterizes all the deep sea's creatures. The siphonophores are another group of deep-sea organisms that reward patient attention. Extraordinary colonies of specialized individuals working together as a single functioning unit. A siphonophore is not a single animal in the usual sense, but a colonial organism, a chain of individual zooids, each of which is specialized for a particular function. Some provide propulsion, others capture prey, others are responsible for reproduction, others provide flotation, and so on. Together, they function as a single integrated organism, coordinating their activities through a network of interconnected tissue. The longest known siphonophore, a species called Praia dubia, can reach lengths of more than 40 meters, making it potentially the longest animal on Earth, longer than a blue whale. These extraordinary transparent chains drift through the mesopelagic zone. Their tentacles spread out in curtains that can cover large areas of water, trapping whatever small organisms swim into them. The curtain of tentacles glows faintly in the dark. Bioluminescent cells activated by contact or vibration, and the whole extraordinary structure moves with slow and ghostly purpose through the dark water. A city of specialized cells organized into a predatory machine of extraordinary efficiency and extraordinary beauty. There is something philosophical about the siphonophore, about the question of whether it is one organism or many, about the way it blurs the boundary between the individual and the collective, between the part and the whole. The cells that make up your own body are, in a certain sense, similar, each one a living entity with its own metabolism and its own chemical machinery, yet together organized into something that transcends any individual component, a whole that is vastly more complex and capable than the sum of its parts. The siphonophore is a more loosely organized version of this same principle, the same fundamental tendency of life to form associations and colonies and communities, to find strength and capability in combination. But these are thoughts for another time, for a more wakeful moment when the mind is ready to follow their implications. Right now, as your thoughts become softer and your eyelids heavier, let the siphonophore simply be beautiful, a long and ghostly presence in the dark water, drifting with patient grace through a world of perpetual night, its cells doing their separate work, its whole being moving slowly through the cold. The cold of the deep ocean is not merely a temperature, but a character, a fundamental quality of the water that shapes everything about the life that exists there. Water at near freezing temperatures has particular physical properties that make it dense and heavy, and this density is what drives the great thermohaline circulation that carries cold, deep water around the globe. At these low temperatures, chemical reactions proceed very slowly, which is why the metabolisms of deep sea creatures are slow, why they live long lives at a measured pace, why they grow slowly and age slowly and reproduce slowly. The cold is not cruel but conservative, preserving and slowing and extending, stretching time out until it becomes something almost geological. In the deep ocean, the boundary between alive and not alive becomes, in a sense, philosophical. The bacteria embedded in the deep sea sediment below the ocean floor, buried meters beneath the ocean floor in material millions of years old, are alive, but only barely. Their metabolisms proceed at such infinitesimally slow rates that a single cell may divide only once every 1,000 years or more. They are not dead, and they are barely alive, existing in a state of such profound suspended activity that they exist at the very margin of what we mean by life. They are consuming the last traces of organic material in sediment that has been buried for millions of years, extracting energy from compounds that were deposited when the sediment formed, sustaining themselves on vanishingly small resources at a pace so slow that the question of whether they are experiencing anything like time in the way we understand it becomes unanswerable. These sub-seafloor bacteria are thought to constitute one of the largest microbial communities on Earth, representing a significant fraction of all the living biomass in the ocean. They are entirely invisible, buried in the dark sediment beneath the dark water of the abyss, doing their nearly imperceptible work over timescales that dwarf everything we ordinarily think of as meaningful. They are the most patient of all of Earth's creatures, and they have been there in various forms since long before anything we might recognize as an animal existed in the ocean above them. The deep sea floor holds another wonder that belongs to the slow and patient language of geology, and that is the phenomenon of turbidity currents, though the word current suggests a gentleness that does not always apply. A turbidity current is a dense, sediment-laden flow that can rush down the slopes of the continental shelf and across the abyssal plain, carrying enormous quantities of sediment from the shallow continental margins into the deep ocean in a matter of hours. These events can be triggered by earthquakes or by the gradual buildup of unstable sediment on steep slopes, and when they occur, they move with a force and a speed that can snap underwater telegraph cables and carve great channels in the deep sea floor. The turbidite deposits left by these events are among the most dramatic features of the deep sea floor. Layers of coarser-grained sediment interbedded with the fine pelagic ooze. Each layer a record of a single catastrophic event that may have lasted only hours, but whose evidence will persist in the geological record for millions of years. The contrast between these brief moments of violence and the unending stillness around them is a reminder that the deep ocean, for all its patience and quiet, is not entirely immune to the sudden and the forceful. That the same planet that created its stillness also created the earthquakes and the landslides that occasionally disturb it. But the disturbance passes, as all disturbances pass, and the stillness returns. The turbidite settles. The fine particles that were suspended in the water column by the event gradually sink back to the floor. The organisms that were disrupted by the flow gradually return or recolonize the disturbed sediment. And after some years, or some decades, the deep sea floor looks as it always has, soft and dark and quiet, with only the subtle layering in the sediment as evidence that anything unusual ever happened. The seamounts that rise from the deep sea floor are among the most biologically rich environments in the deep ocean, though they are rarely thought of in this context. These underwater mountains, formed by volcanic activity and rising thousands of meters from the surrounding abyssal plain without breaking the surface, concentrate food and create unique physical environments that support unusually diverse communities of organisms. Where the current is forced to flow over and around a seamount, it often creates an upwelling of nutrient-rich deep water toward the surface, which supports dense concentrations of plankton and fish and the larger predators that feed on them. The slopes of seamounts are often covered in cold water corals, which are very different from the warm water tropical corals most people are familiar with, but are equally beautiful and ecologically important. These corals grow in the cold, dark water below the sunlit zone, sometimes at depths of several hundred to several thousand meters, building elaborate three-dimensional structures of calcium carbonate that provide habitat for extraordinary communities of fish and invertebrates. A single large cold-water coral reef can be home to hundreds of species, a complex and self-sustaining ecosystem in the dark water, far from any human knowledge or observation. Cold-water corals grow very slowly, at rates comparable to the stalactites of caves, perhaps a millimeter or less per year. And the largest known cold-water coral structures are thousands of years old. A coral mound that extends several meters from the rock substrate may have been growing since before recorded history, accumulating its intricate structure of calcium carbonate polyp by polyp, year by year in the dark, cold water, building a structure that outlasts any individual animal by thousands of years. The coral mound persists because each generation of polyps grows on the skeleton of the generation before it, adding new living tissue to an ever-accumulating structure of ancient calcium carbonate, reaching back through time in the mineral record of its own growth. The bioluminescent animals of the deep ocean are so numerous and so various that any adequate description of them would take longer than the night allows. But a few more deserve a gentle mention, because their particular forms of light carry their own quiet poetry. The lanternfish are small, often no more than a few centimeters long, but they are among the most abundant vertebrates on Earth, and they are the primary participants in the diel vertical migration described earlier, rising to the surface at night and sinking back into the deep during the day. They are named for the rows of light-producing organs called photophores that line their undersides and flanks, organs that can be arranged in species-specific patterns used for recognition and communication. A school of lanternfish moving through the deep water at night is a cloud of tiny lights, each fish surrounded by its own constellation of blue-green points. The whole school moving together through the dark water in a slow pulse of collective bioluminescence. The dragonfish are longer and more fearsome in appearance, with hinged jaws that allow them to swallow prey larger than their own heads, and with rows of light-producing organs along their flanks and chin. Some species of dragonfish produce not blue-green light but red light, which is a rare ability in the deep ocean, where red wavelengths are absorbed so quickly by water that even the surface sunlight carries no red light to the depths. By producing red light that other animals cannot detect, these fish effectively have a private flashlight, able to illuminate and observe prey without being detected. The prey swims past, unaware that it is visible, lit by a light it cannot see, unaware of the slow, dark presence waiting in the dark. There are fish in the deep ocean that are almost perfectly transparent, their bodies like glass, their organs visible through the clear tissues of their flesh. These crystal-like adaptations reduce the chance of producing a shadow or a silhouette that a predator might detect, rendering the fish effectively invisible even when illuminated by the bioluminescent flashes of the deep sea. Some species take this transparency so far that even their eyes are transparent, except for the tiny dark spot of the photoreceptor cells themselves, floating in the water like a pair of disembodied pupils. And there are fish that have evolved eyes pointing directly upward, the better to detect the silhouettes of prey swimming above them against the faint downwelling light from the surface. The barrel-eye fish, whose formal name is Macropina microstoma, has large tubular eyes that point upward through a transparent, dome-shaped head, scanning the water above it for any shadow or movement that might indicate a meal. When filmed by deep-sea cameras, the barrel-eye looks like a creature from the edges of imagination, its transparent head revealing the green-tinted barrel-shaped eyes beneath, oriented upward with a quality of patient vigilance that seems almost meditative. And perhaps it is, in its way, this fish that spends its life looking up at a faint and distant light, waiting in the quiet dark. The abyssal plain is not entirely without a topographic relief, even beyond the abyssal hills, because it is punctuated here and there by the ancient eroded stumps of seamounts that have long since subsided beneath the waves. These flat-topped submarine mesas, called guyots, are the remnants of volcanic islands that once rose above the surface of the ocean, perhaps millions of years ago, and were worn down by waves and erosion until they were flat-topped, and then gradually subsided beneath the sea surface as the oceanic crust beneath them cooled and contracted and sank. Today, they sit below the ocean surface, their flat summits perhaps a few hundred meters down, or 1,000 meters or more, depending on how old they are and how much subsidence has occurred. On the flat tops of guyots, the sediment is sometimes thin, because the current flows more freely across these elevated surfaces and carries fine particles away, leaving behind a pavement of older, harder material. The biological communities on guyot summits can be distinct from those on the surrounding abyssal plain, with a different mix of species taking advantage of the harder substrate and the stronger currents. And in the past, when sea levels were lower or the guyots were not yet as deeply submerged, some of these flat-topped mounts may have been shallow reef environments, home to tropical corals and the rich communities they support. Their biological heritage buried now beneath kilometers of water and decades of sediment. The history of the Earth is written in its ocean floors, in layers and structures and chemical signatures that patient scientists are only beginning to read with any fluency. The story they are reading is one of continuous change, of continents drifting and colliding and rifting apart, of oceans opening and closing, of climate shifting between warm and cold and warm again, of life diversifying and occasionally suffering catastrophic reductions and then diversifying again, more varied and more complex after each recovery than before. The deep ocean has witnessed all of this history. It has received the fallout from the great mass extinctions, the layers of iridium that mark the impact that ended the age of dinosaurs, the dark, organic-rich sediments that record the periods when the ocean became anoxic and most of its inhabitants suffocated, the chemical signatures of ancient greenhouse conditions and ice ages. All of these events are preserved in the sediment, waiting for the right instrument and the right question, patient as the ocean itself. And through all of those events, through all of those extinctions and recoveries and climatic upheavals, the deep ocean maintained its fundamental character. Cold, dark, patient, cycling the materials of life through its slow and thoroughgoing processes. It was changed by each event. Its chemistry shifted. Its communities altered, but it persisted, and life with it, and eventually it returned to something close to what it had been before, carrying the scars of the event in its chemistry and its sediment, but essentially intact. The deep ocean is resilient in ways that the surface cannot be, buffered by its depth and its mass and its ancient inertia against the rapid changes that periodically devastate the shallower and more exposed environments above. There is one final thought about the deep ocean that feels right for the end of this quiet journey, and it concerns the way the deep ocean looks in the beams of a submersible's lights, to the very rare human beings who have descended far enough to see it directly. Every scientist and explorer who has spent time in the deep ocean has reported something similar, a quality of stillness that is unlike anything experienced at the surface, a profundity of quiet that goes beyond the merely physical absence of wind and waves and reaches into something more interior, something that feels like the stillness of very old things, of geological time made present and tangible. There is no day or night in the deep ocean. There are no seasons. The water temperature changes by less than a degree across centuries. The pressure is constant. The darkness is unvarying. Every reference point by which we ordinarily orient ourselves in time and space dissolves at these depths, leaving only the immediate experience of being in that vast and quiet place, suspended in cold, dark water kilometers from any shore and kilometers from any surface, in a world that does not know you are there and has never needed to. And every person who has been there has come back changed, in some quiet way, by that encounter with depth and stillness and ancient patience. The deep ocean has a way of putting the ordinary concerns of human life into a perspective that is difficult to achieve in any other way. A perspective of geological time and planetary scale that makes the small urgencies and anxieties of daily life feel, briefly and gently, less pressing, more manageable, more clearly what they are, temporary and passing, like weather on the surface of a very deep and very old and very patient sea. Let that perspective settle into you like fine sediment settling through still water, gently, evenly, covering everything in a thin and peaceful layer of calm. The day was what it was. Tomorrow will be what it will be. And beneath it all, beneath all the days and all the concerns and all the urgency of living, there is something that does not change, something deep and cold and patient and enduring, the same fundamental stillness that exists at the bottom of the ocean, that has always existed there, that will continue to exist long after everything temporary has passed. Let that thought be the last complex thought of this journey, a final resting point before everything becomes simpler and softer and more completely dark. Something is alive in the deepest dark, in the oldest sediment, at the slowest pace the concept of life allows, consuming the very last traces of ancient light that reached the ocean's surface many millions of years ago, captured by organisms long since vanished, sunk to the ocean floor, buried, and now being used, one molecule at a time, by bacteria too small to see and too slow to observe, in a process so patient and so thorough that it makes the very concept of time feel provisional. You too are processing today. Your sleeping brain will work through the experiences and emotions and sensations of this day, consolidating what is worth keeping and releasing what is not, weaving the day's material into the larger fabric of your memory and yourself. This work happens best in sleep, in the quiet dark of rest, and it requires nothing of your conscious mind. You do not have to help it. You do not have to direct it. You only need to be still and warm and safe, and let it happen in its own way, at its own pace. The deep ocean is doing the same thing in its way, processing, cycling, receiving the material of one day and working it slowly into the larger fabric of the ocean's history, transforming it and moving it, and eventually incorporating it into something new. The ocean is old enough and large enough that nothing is lost, only changed, and the patience of that change is something you can feel now, in the slowness of your breath, in the heaviness of your body against the surface beneath you, in the way the day is receding, softly and naturally, like a tide going out. You are drifting now. The deep ocean floor is very far below, dark and cold and patient, with its soft sediment and its slow creatures and its ancient bacterial communities, and its hydrothermal vents glowing warm in the dark. And you are far above it, floating, warm, safe, in the comfortable space between waking and sleep, where thoughts are light and the day's concerns have the quality of half-remembered dreams. The foraminifera are still sinking, one by one, from the sunlit surface above, their intricate shells drifting downward through the water column in their patient weeks-long fall. The manganese nodules are still growing, one imperceptible layer at a time, on the sediment of the abyssal plain. The tube worms at the hydrothermal vents are still extending their red plumes into the mineral-rich water, patient and blind and perfectly content. The giant squid is somewhere in the darkness, its enormous eyes searching for the bioluminescent flash of distant prey. The vampire squid is drifting in the oxygen-poor water, its webbed arms folded around it, eating the slow fall of marine snow with quiet efficiency. The Greenland shark is moving through the cold, dark, slow and ancient and unhurried. And somewhere, in the deepest trench, in the absolute darkness of the Hadal zone, an amphipod is picking its way across the soft sediment, processing a tiny fragment of organic material that fell from the surface world above, doing its patient work in the most extreme and quiet place on Earth, completely unconcerned with anything beyond the immediate, small territory of its existence. All of these creatures and processes are continuing right now, as you rest. The ocean is doing what the ocean has always done, slowly and completely in the dark. And you can rest in the knowledge of that continuity, that the world does not require your attention tonight, that it has managed its ancient patient work for billions of years without your direction and will continue to do so while you sleep. Let your thoughts soften now. Let the deep ocean dissolve into a general impression of blue darkness and quiet and depth, the specific facts and creatures and processes dissolving back into the larger wash of the ocean itself, which has no need of specific names or categories. It only needs to be itself, cold and dark and patient and whole. Your breath is slow. Your body is heavy. The surface you are resting on is solid and warm and supportive, holding all of your weight without effort, as the ocean floor holds all the weight of the water above it, without strain, without complaint, simply present and solid and reliably there. Let the day be finished. Let it dissolve, the way the organic material of the surface ocean dissolves as it sinks through the dark water, becoming first smaller, then thinner, then finally nothing but a memory in the chemistry of the deep. The day was real, and it mattered, and now it is over, and you are here in the quiet and the warmth, with nothing required of you at all. The ocean is very dark, the ocean is very deep, the ocean is very old and very patient, and very still in its deepest places, and all of its creatures are going about their quiet business in the dark. And you do not need to know anything about them tonight. You only need to be here, which you already are, and to rest, which you are already doing, slowly and completely and without effort. Let the darkness of the deep ocean be a comfortable darkness, not the darkness of absence, but the darkness of depth, of everything that lies beneath the surface of things, rich and old and quiet. Let that darkness settle over you now, softly, like the finest sediment sinking slowly through still water, covering everything in a thin and peaceful layer of rest. You are warm. You are safe. You are exactly where you are meant to be. The deep ocean continues its patient work below, as it always has and always will. And you can sleep now, gently and completely, in your own quiet darkness, far above the cold and the pressure and the extraordinary patient and ancient life of the deep. Let it all be still. Let everything be still. You are drifting softly in the dark. The ocean is with you, somewhere far below, deep and old and incomprehensibly vast and calm, holding its ancient silence as it has held it through every night that has ever passed on this planet, through every creature that has ever slept on land or sea, through every quiet moment and every troubled one. The same patient dark water cycling slowly through its ancient circuits, breathing its slow geological breath, neither knowing nor needing to know anything about the small, warm creatures resting on the surface above, but present nonetheless, enduring, constant, deep, and the ocean is with you, deep and old and calm, holding its ancient silence, breathing its slow and steady breath, patient as the sediment, quiet as the dark water, drifting, drifting, still.